welcome to Varn vlog. I can't even say my own name right. And today we are with Wolfe talking about the legacy and relevance of Loren Goldner. I mostly know Goldner from his editing of Insurgent Notes, which I read somewhat religiously in the early teens. And I have two of his books back there. But we're going to be talking about them in a larger perspective today. His trajectory as like the lone left communist in the period of high post-structuralism, which must have been really lonely. And his critique of post-colonialism and reactionary anti-imperialism, his arguments with I've recently covered an essay he did that was I think too harsh of a review of Max Elbaum's Revolutions in the Air. But I think
I love that review.
Yeah, I think it's an important counter history to what Elbaum's trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
People are like, "Oh, well, why do you suggest that book?" I'm like, I'm not suggesting that book, the Elbaum book, because it portrays the new communist movement well. I actually think there's kind of like an unintended counter history in that book. But today we're going to be talking about his legacy in general, the role he played in maintaining some view of left communism outside of the formal left communist sectarian organizations such as the International Communist Tendency, the International Communist Current, the Internationalist Communist Party. Is it internationalist or international? I'm always confused.
International Communist Party, and there are a couple of them at least. They're mainly just in Italy, though.
Right. I know some people who are in them in America, but they mostly answer to the Italian section. And I think there's at least two, because they're split between true Bordigist and Dementist. And I put those in quotations because I don't want to deal with who counts as a true Bordigist and who doesn't, because that's
I know there's some members who in Croatia who had been sort of independent left communists who I guess have since just become members of the ICP abroad.
Yeah. And we will be referring a little bit to an episode of the Antifada, which is a memorial episode that will be linked in the show notes for people who want probably a bigger dip into Goldner's biography, and from people who knew him. I did not know Loren, and Loren, and so I my only interactions with him personally were dealing with the fallout around Michael Rettenwald, now attempted candidate of the Libertarian Party, I believe.
Idea.
Yeah, I also used to write for Insurgent Notes. And so we want to talk about his legacy. So you have met Loren. You weren't close friends with him. You weren't like buddies, but you have met him. Why do you think it was so important? And why was he such a key figure to any kind of left communist revival?
Well, it's interesting. Like, he was kind of alone in the wilderness for decades, really. The kind of remarkable figure who, a lot of the people who are the guest rotation of the Intifada, who write for various ultra left publications and even more mainstream publications today, were mentored by him. He really, especially after the financial crash, a lot of sort of independent-minded leftists, Marxists, anarchists, and so on, really gravitated around him because he'd been, consistently putting out these essays, writing. I think a lot of the LibCon people and the Mute magazine people had published his writings, and he was a mainstay in the New York ultra left scene. And so, for that reason, just because of the sort of imprint that he left in terms of just mentoring various other writers, theorists, intellectuals. I mean, he he has a major legacy. Like he really, left a lot in terms of just conversations and articles and whatnot over the years.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I think Insurgent Notes was kind of a for some of the his. I think he mentored a lot of people, and I also think he played a particular role in the kind of left communist critique of Occupy that emerged around 2012, 2013. And he was also very wary of I mean, he really had a thing out for Maoism. Actually, like it was a big part of his overall milieu. So
Yeah, I mean, and like he did, that especially toward the end, he had
mhm.
this ongoing, like over a decade long engagement with the class struggle in China. He had a number of contacts there. He was teaching himself Mandarin. One of the things that comes through in the Antifada episode, memorializing him, is just how much of a polyglot he was. He knew over 6 languages. I don't think he was fluent in Mandarin, but he was familiarizing himself with it so that he would be able to comment on ongoing struggles more intelligently, using primary sources and whatnot. But yeah, he uh, I think it must have been like 2012, 2013 came out with notes on Maoism broadly. It was very, very polemical, pissed a lot of people off. But you mentioned the Max Albaum book. He had a very, very polemical review of that. Again, because he had been so active in the 60s and he'd seen a lot of that stuff. Max Albaum was a member of groups that he was engaged in long-standing disputes with, and so the sort of nostalgia that Albaum evinced in Revolution is in the Air. Um, that was not how Loren remembered it at all, and he really, made sure he fixed on a lot of the things that Albaum and others probably would have preferred to forget, and just directed the reader's attention to that, all the elisions and all the things that were skipped over, that were rather unsavory from the history of American Maoism.
Yeah, he was very good at that. I think the other thing. I mean, he's an interesting figure also in that he's one of these people who came out of the independent socialist movement, which was the old IS before the IS became the International Socialist Movement when it kind of merged with the Cliffites.
Mm-hmm.
Which Hal Draper did not join it, but I was sort of like laughing once when I was like going through Hal Draper's immediate cadre, and I was like, anarchist, left communist, like, um, it, which for some people, even some of my audience, is going to be a condemning factor. But it is interesting that he starts off in a kind of Trotskyist milieu, but finds it very unsatisfactory. Um,
Yeah,
and
and I
yeah,
think like it comes out like he really was quite responsible for the rediscovery of Luxembourg in a sort of non like. There's a very particular way that various trot sects read Luxembourg as kind of, and I think there's some truth to it as kind of the German Lenin or almost Lenin, uh,
mm-hmm.
insofar as she wanted to found a German Bolshevik party. But reading her in a way that is not just assimilable to Leninism as just an adjunct of Leninism, um, is in a very original way. He was very, very interested in her writings on imperialism and really saw her theories as central to his own understanding of imperialism. I I personally probably have more problems with some aspects of Luxembourg's economic theories than Goldner did, but for him, she was a central reference, and that was very significant, especially in the 70s and 80s, foregrounding her the way that he did. And then, of course, there was he wrote a very influential essay in the 90s for Hillel Tichton's journal Critique on Amadeo Bordiga and the agrarian question. Very, very interesting. That was largely through his own awareness of Bordiga and that tradition. You mentioned we were talking beforehand, Philippe Bournet, who's a historian, ex-ICC guy, who did a history of Italian Bordigism and council communism in Germany and Holland. But really, I think most of that stuff was translated into English. So really, like in terms of like original source, like English language material, until Endnotes came out, most of that was through Loren and just maybe just a handful of others. And that was largely through his contacts in France, because he lived in France for a number of years. He knew Kamat and Devey and others, or at least corresponded with them. I'm pretty sure he knew them personally, but he was, he had a firsthand familiarity with them. He knew a lot of the ICP people in Italy, stayed with them, and so he was writing about this stuff from like the late 80s through the 90s, and awakening people to this entire other tradition that then became a bit better known after the first volume of Endnotes, I think.
Yeah, I was about to say my introduction to Bordiga was volume 1 of Endnotes, and Goldner's essay simultaneously. Then I got the Bournet book. Now I know enough to know that actually even the Bournet book is somewhat flawed, because it actually repeats some Communist Party of Italy propaganda against Bordiga as truth, because it wasn't very well discovered yet. I mean, one of the unfortunate things about how long it takes to get stuff out is there's a good, now we have a good scholarly approved good translation of a fair amount of the Bordiga writings that aren't just from independent left communists trying to get it out on very tiny presses from Brill Haymarket, and the work of people like Basso and David Broder have really kind of corrected a lot of stuff that was repeated in the French tradition, because I think the French tradition was just operating off of what they got, and that's where we got Bordiga from, was the French tradition, not really, with the exception of like maybe like the 5 people in the 90s who were in the Internationalist Communist Party or the International Communist Party or whatever. That's where we got a lot of our initial view of Bordiga, was from the French ultra left after the 70s, and I mean, I find that interesting in a lot of ways. That Goldner was basically this lone guy that was respected by non-left communists. This is one of the things that makes him a little different. I mean, usually left communists have a reputation of getting along with nobody. Like Paul Maddock, both junior and senior, pretty easy to get along with. Goldner is pretty easy to get along with, but if you've ever dealt in the comment section of any time you touch on anything related to Bordiga and see the immediate sectarian squabbling that comes out, or like trying to figure out any kind of council communist debate and seeing the immediate sectarian squabbling that comes out, Goldner was interesting in that he, for all of his like insistence on a line, he was easy enough for people who were not part of that line to get along with. And also could make that line appealing to people who were not already dyed in the wool left communist sectarians. So that seems kind of important given the rebirth. But I was going to ask you, like, I guess we have to the Endnotes thing is interesting because Goldner's perspective is quite different from Endnotes and communization theory. And communization emerging from the Bordiga's current is actually never totally, I mean, I know genealogically why that happened, but it's never entirely made sense to me. So would you like to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, Goldner probably would have been sympathetic to communization as represented by somebody like Dubin, more so than by Theorie Communiste or by Endnotes. And Endnotes, the first volume, it basically just reviews this debate between Troploin, Deve, and on the one side, and Theory Communiste on the other side. And I would say more or less ends up siding with Theory Communiste, although they have some quibbles with their periodization of history. They generally view the sort of eclipse of the horizon of the workers' movement as, and this is what the subsequent volumes of Endnotes, at least up through 4, especially in volume 4, are talking about is talking about the sort of end of the horizon of the revolutionary horizon of the workers' movement. That's, I mean, for Goldner.
Go ahead.
Yeah, for Goldner, like the sun really never set on the workers' movement. Finally, so that horizon had not been extinguished.
I mean, by the history of separation, Endnotes is going so far as to say the workers' movement was never real. Like you know, it's
yeah. I mean, it views it as like a sort of moment within the history of capitalism that has since passed.
Right.
That inspired a number of understandable and perhaps sympathetic programs, which no longer are tenable because of the fact that this horizon no longer exists, and it believes that there are these structural reasons for that, and it's a very interesting history, one I tend not to agree with as much. And Goldner really, for him, the working class was still the only viable subject of history, and that's why so even if the industrial proletariat in the most advanced capitalist countries of the world was no longer central, he still saw it as the real locomotive of history, even if it had been dispersed to the global south and other places. So for him, I mean, he really took a lot of issue with third worldists, certainly people who just upheld the sort of national struggles of third world countries against American imperialism and whatnot, as that's the revolutionary horizon. He really argued vehemently against that. But for him, the working class struggles within those countries was immensely important. And he had tons of contacts. I think actually when you were in Korea, he had been active there a few years prior, just working with various unions, working with various groups that were organizing, looking to, obviously they couldn't be openly communist, because I do think that they still have
the national security law would have gotten deported. I mean, like, I was careful about that when I was in Korea. Yeah, so
yeah, I think they're still on the books. Like there's the death penalty for like avowed communists.
I don't think it's actually been used, but yeah, it's also very easy to get deported if you're accused of being a communist. So
yeah, if you're not a citizen, yeah,
right,
even more so. But in any case, he had a lot of contacts there. So I mean, one of the things that came out of the discussion in the Intifada was just like all these different places that he lived. He was often in the wrong place at the wrong time, but he was at the center of the action. During various stretches, he had a lot of contacts in Portugal and Spain. He wrote a very interesting reflection in the mid '70s when those twin revolutions were happening, the sort of downfall of fascism in Spain, Ubu saved from drowning. Then, yeah, he was the librarian at Harvard for a number of years, and after that point, after he lost his job there, he moved around a lot, spent a lot of time in France. I believe he lived there for a couple of years at least. Again, he was fluent in Spanish and French and all these other languages, and that's what allowed him. I mean, it was interesting. Like, if you read through the archive of his works on breaktheirhaughtypower.net, which is like easily the most complete archive of his writings online, he's got these reviews of obscure French books arguing against the post-structuralists. He's upholding Marxism in the early 80s against post-colonial thought, which was, again, it was a very, very new, it was a very new formation at the time. It was a new current even within the academy. And so it's interesting that he included that and a number of other very interesting essays and a great collection, The Vanguard of Retrogression. He viewed that as and again, this is where it kind of dovetails with his earlier opposition to Maoism. He thought of post-colonial thought as a kind of academicized, epistemological translation of the monthly review school of sort of third worldism, the sort of Samir Amin style dependency theory, which he was very much opposed to. And against that, he upheld the universality of Marx. But again, like what's great about him is he was dogmatically Hegelian Marxist. So like he wasn't opposing this kind of vulgar materialism against it. I'm forgetting what essay it was, but he explained that Marx's materialism was not just a materialism of things, but a materialism of social relations that are mediated by a thing, namely commodities. And this allowed him to approach this and other matters very dialectically, very intelligently. It wasn't just, it wasn't just saying that, so-and-so post-colonial thinker was just deviating from the truth of Marxism. He was able to sort of spell it out conceptually in a very, very compelling way. And yeah, he did this, he had a great review of a book by Fay against Derrida. Just very interesting. And one of the ways I came into contact with him was, of course, like I studied with Moishe Pistone at University of Chicago, and just reading around critical reviews of Pistone's Time, Labor, and Social Domination, which is his sort of grand theoretical treatise. Definitely one of the most interesting ones, one of the most insightful ones that was, critical but appreciative of Pistone was from Goldner. I was very, very impressed by that. I became more familiar with his work too in organizing a panel for Platypus back in 2012 between him and Paul Maddock and David Harvey and Andrew Kleiman. And after that, I really read him because I was so taken by what he had said. All of his ideas about fictitious capital and its relation to the sort of the economic downturn. I began reading his writings much more in earnest, and that's when I really began corresponding with him through email, meeting up with him the times that I did, and just viewing him, albeit at a bit more of a distance, as a mentor figure as well. Yeah, he's just a towering intellect. It's great too. He has this other great, I reposted it on my blog, a number of years ago, but a 2-part essay from Race Trader called Race and Enlightenment, or Race and the Enlightenment. I'm forgetting which, but it's amazing. It shows the way that the modern concept of race developed out of the Enlightenment as the sort of intellectual reflection of bourgeois society, just the way that it developed historically, but the way that there was the seeds of its overcoming within bourgeois society then presented themselves, and the sort of complex and dialectical relationship to it. Really, like at a number of times, I viewed his own attitude towards the Enlightenment, because it wasn't just this essay. He had several, I think, actually, talking about Newton and Kepler, He was a great champion of Kepler. He actually thought that if the Enlightenment had been more Keplerian rather than Newtonian, that it might have even had more emancipatory promise. He I viewed his sort of understanding of the Enlightenment as very, very similar, tracking very similarly with Adorno and Horkheimer's, which is probably one of the areas that I disagreed, at least with his writings, the most, was because in the 80s, and I think this is an understandable reaction on Goldner's part, he assimilated a lot of the Frankfurt School's thought to a sort of Heideggerianism in sort of viewing it as the domination of nature, largely because I think this is the way that the Frankfurt School was in the academy. It was viewed as, despite Adorno's polemics against Heidegger and the jargon of authenticity, it was viewed as largely along the same lines. It was largely, the Frankfurt School was largely seen as saying the same thing as the various Heideggerian French theorists and the post-structuralists. So I think that somewhat colored his view of the Frankfurt School and of Adorno and Horkheimer. Though I believe, I might be wrong about this, Jake Blumenfeld, who was also very close, communist in situ, who was very close with Goldner. I believe he told me that he'd had conversations with Goldner where he had come around a bit on his appraisal of the Frankfurt School. So
interesting. Well, the Frankfurt School is interesting for a variety of reasons, and that is one. There's the Marcusean Heideggerianism. There's their questionable attitude towards the working class. I mean, when you think about Lash's Big War, like he agrees with the Frankfurt School until they start talking about the working class, and then he's like super annoyed with them. But I do think that domination of nature stuff was really big in certain circles in the 80s and 90s, even though he was arguing against a lot of other usage of that same thought and post-structuralist theory. So that's an interesting sort of
because I mean, like, Goldner was a rationalist in the sense that he believed that the project of Marxism was to save the Enlightenment from its sort of undialectical rationality or rationalism, which of course already within the Enlightenment there were figures like Rousseau who did, and others who thought dialectically. There were within the Enlightenment there were concepts that lent themselves to that the sort of irrationality that then came to prevail over society under capitalism. And I think that, I mean, the way that Goldner argued against the kind of one-sided rationality of some Enlightenment thinkers, and the same way that Adorno and Horkheimer did as well in their book, again, it's eminently dialectical. It's looking to overcome the Enlightenment in a sort of enlightened fashion to sort of fulfill its latent promises in a way that the French post-structuralists, and certainly insofar as their heirs of Heidegger, were not interested in doing that. They were looking to decenter, anthropology and humanity and whatnot, and the subject itself, and even cast doubt on the coherence of the idea of a subject. Adorno, Horkheimer, and I would say Goldner as well were very much invested in the idea of an historical subject that was contradictory, but could potentially free itself from this irrationality.
So, if you were going to tell some people where to start with Goldner's work, where would you tell them to start?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. I would say it depends on what you're looking for. The Universality of Marx is a great essay to start with. If you're interested in his criticisms of Maoism, his notes on Maoism from 2012 is great. Race and the Enlightenment is outstanding. It really showcases his just the breadth of his knowledge. I mean, but again, he'd written so much, like, in such interesting ways. I mean, the essay on Bordiga is very good, and two of his historical essays, one on the history of um, the Bolsheviks and their interactions with Ataturk and the Turks in the 20s. The first, it's interesting because many Trotskyists view the sort of fatal move of the later Comintern was to side with the bourgeois nationalists in China, siding with Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang party against the sort of homegrown communists. And one of the interesting things, sort of asides, that Goldner polemically makes in the notes on Maoism is that Mao opposed Stalin's line on this not because he wanted to oppose Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, but because he actually wanted to be closer with them than Stalin was comfortable with. This was, of course, all prior to the 1927 massacre that really set them obviously against each other as sort of mortal enemies. But so Goldner pointed out that this a quite similar policy propped up in the earlier 20s insofar as the Bolsheviks were willing to sort of prop up Ataturk and even advise Turkish communists to side with the nationalists in Turkey. And for Goldner, this is like a fatal mistake. This is part of his broader opposition to sort of national liberation and the support of bourgeois nationalist parties in peripheral, semi-pro, using world systems language. He viewed that as a vital mistake, albeit it is one that I think that's part of the reason why Trotsky was eventually able to find refuge in Turkey, at least for a few years, is because there had been these prior cordial relations in the 20s. But yeah, so that's a very interesting essay. His essay on Bolivia is really outstanding. I think Brill Haymarket actually picked that one up as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, very, very good essay. That it's possible. I mostly read all this stuff when it was on his website. The essay on Turkey might actually be in that collection as well.
I believe it is. So
yeah. So that these, in terms of like his historical essays, those are really great. If you're interested in just a sort of broad sense of his thought and his understanding of revolutionary history, there is a I don't know if it's called like a crash course in world revolution or intro to world revolution. It's like a 3-part lecture series that he gave. And it was great talking on the Intifada because there were a number of people who actually attended these lectures that he delivered in the basement of a Wendy's, just talking, off the top of his head about basically the history of revolutionary thought and the revolutionary movement from Marx down through, I would say, around the middle of the 20th century. It's very broad strokes. There are occasional errors that he makes, but again, these are errors because he's just, again, reciting everything from memory. But that gives you a good sense of kind of where he falls. He had a very famous quote that was taken up by Bini Adamzak in her book, Yesterday is Tomorrow, which is that at a certain point in the 70s, you could kind of infer somebody's entire political and historical worldview based on what date they chose as the date that everything went wrong in the Russian Revolution. So if somebody said it was 1919, if somebody said it was 21, 23, 27, if somebody said that it was 56 or 91, then you knew you could ascertain a whole host of related positions. For him, his answer to that question, and he did give it was 1921. So he did actually follow the sort of Bordiga line on that, where the third Congress of the Comintern was kind of the final one that was kind of ecumenically acknowledged by him. But yeah, I mean, I would check out any one of those essays. He's a brilliant and quite lucid writer, extremely, and again, he could range from very sophisticated and dense
Mm-hmm.
writing, though I would say it's never kind of academically dense, um, or sort of jargon laden in the way that a lot of sort of academic Marxism is. Um, to you know, some very very demanding. His book on Herman Melville is quite demanding, but
Mm-hmm.
extremely interesting. I've not made my entire way through that book entirely, but it's you know largely because I haven't read the entire all of the works of Melville, and it requires familiarity with all of that to really grasp what he's getting at. So um, I had to keep stopping every couple chapters in that to kind of understand what he was referencing. Um, but in any case, so he could go from very popular presentations of revolutionary history to very very um, erudite uh, literary and social criticism. um, he was really a towering intellect, and I think the reason why his loss has been felt so acutely is just because he took such time to mentor people, and because like his writings, even more broadly, even the people who never met him, who never really interacted with him, have familiarized themselves with his writing, and have, because there is so much, because it is so rich, there's a lot to chew on, a lot that they can take inspiration from.
Well, one of the interesting things about Goldner that is somewhat similar to someone who's close to my heart, but from a very, very different perspective. I mean, basically, we're talking about moving from ultra leftism to one might call right deviationism or populism or something like that. And that's Christopher Lash, because they both had encyclopedic knowledges of the early 20th century left wing movement. Um, I mean, Goldner, like, I've gone through some things Goldner's written, and occasionally he'll get stuff wrong about minor events, but they're like minor events that nobody else knows about at all.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly with Lash, there's some issues that I have with him and how like his recountings of specific incidences of the SPPA, for example, um, are some of his readings of Freud later on in his late career, or his weird obsession with Sorel in his late career. Um, but that Lash was actually acutely interested in ways a lot of the new left was not in something like the precursor left in to the new left, so like the actual old left as it existed in the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries. um, uh, I wanted to ask you, a little bit about that. I mean, we can compare them as like a launching point to going maybe talking about Lash a little bit. I know you wanted to talk about that, and we can kind of use this as a contrast and study. Um, One of the interesting things, though, that has often been that Marxist Leninists will often accuse left comms of being is that we're one step from being either negationists or secret conservatives. And for people who don't know what negationism is, that's a French tendency that tends to downplay the Holocaust or even deny it. Um,
Yeah,
as
and
a
one that had some rather unfortunate connections to actual French Bordigists, who
Mhm.
had a bookshop, La Ville Taupe, that actually some of the most notorious Holocaust deniers in France were these Bordigists. Yeah.
Bordigist, and also some former anarchists who got in with the Bordigists. Like there's people around that group who wrote um militancy, the highest form of alienation or whatever, that also ended up around La Ville Taupe. But so, I realize there's a danger in bringing it up. I also remember one day Amy Therese, of all people, for those of you who don't know, our actually existing Australian friend, There was a rumor that maybe she wasn't a real person for a while. So I was thinking about, maybe we could talk about that, because one of the things that Amy Therese would always do is she would bring up Bordiga and Lash in the same sentence. Now, funnily enough, I always found that kind of amusing, because who on the left has an obsession with Bordiga and Lash? It's your boy here. But in general, that's a very weird,
It's a weird
chocolate,
pairing.
chocolate and fish kind of pairing. So we could talk about it a little bit, in that both Lash and Goldner were critiquing a lot of the same left. Like, they were very uncomfortable with both the kind of Congress of Cultural Freedom proto-neoconservative left, and the Lash has really harsh things to say about Frantz Fanon fans and stuff. So, and people who were completely abandoning the American working class. In fact, that was one of the reasons why he cited for walking away from Marxism, is that he thought that Marxists had actually abandoned their subject. So
Yeah, and I mean, I was interested in talking about Lash for a number of reasons. Just my own research. I'm interested. I know that you're writing this book with a colleague,
Shell and Van Tine.
as well. So I'm just eager to talk about Lash for various reasons. Goldner, I mean, again, like I'm not positing any real affinity between him and Lash, though there is interestingly an offhand reference that he makes in one of his more obscure essays to Lash, where he says, I actually looked it up while you were talking here. He says, one can agree or disagree with someone like Lash. And as an aside, I would imagine that Goldner tended to disagree with Lash more than he agreed with Lash. But Goldner continues. He says, but can one argue that there's any contemporary novelist who's come close to his analysis of American culture and its malaise in the past 30 years? He was writing this essay in the 30s or in the 90s, talking about why for the previous 30 years, he believed that like the generation of struggle around 68 and afterwards really didn't produce any really truly great novel in his opinion. But in any case, he seemed to, at least in that, appreciate some of the sort of broader diagnosis that Lash made of the sort of cultural malaise of modernity, certainly of American society during that period. I'm curious because like it's interesting. Like I've been rereading. Many years ago I read The Agony of the American Left. More recently, just in doing a bunch of research on Marxist approaches to the family, which is a much richer subject than even I was aware of. And I believe I've actually unearthed a lot of material that it has never been translated into English. That's very, very interesting and could contribute a lot to the various debates around the family within Marxist circles and Marx adjacent circles today. But as doing my due diligence, of course, I revisited Haven in a Heartless World by Lash and the follow-up book, Culture of Narcissism. It's interesting too because a buddy of mine, Eric John Russell, recently translated a book by the French, the Debord biographer, Anselm Yop, and he's also a value critic, part of the Vert critique tendency, kind of close to, was very close when he was alive with Robert Kurtz, was a great admirer of Moishe Bastone. Anselm Yop has this book, The Self-Devouring Society, where he takes up a lot of the themes of Christopher Lash and his idea of a culture of narcissism, and tries to ground it in the sort of boundless appetite and the sort of emptiness of or the emptied subject of capitalist society, with its sort of boundless appetites for more and more of it knows not what. And the way it's interesting. He really does try to get into the nitty gritty of Freudian theory, the Freudian diagnosis of narcissism, which is, I mean, there's both primary and secondary narcissism, so there are different levels of
Yeah,
narcissism. Yeah,
and Lash clearly like actually equates the different levels of narcissism to different periods of capital development, which I think most people miss when they're reading Culture of Narcissism. So primary narcissism is actually related to early Fordism, and secondary narcissism is related to the beginnings of neoliberalism. By the time neoliberalism is fully instantiated, Lash actually isn't writing in those terms anymore, but one gets the feeling that he would have seen post neoliberalism as something like total psychic devastation. And the reason why he would have is that Lash very much does not believe in like the atomized individual, but he does define individuals' understanding of the world. At least he does define this after he writes Haven in the Heartless World, about their relations to the family and the way that family is ensconced in a broader political economy. So when people read, I actually think the worst book of Lash to start with is his most famous book. Culture of Narcissism by itself is actually really misleading. Like,
yeah, I think it mostly makes sense. Like, it was kind of written as a sequel to Haven in a Heartless World, which made like a major splash itself. Obviously, it was very controversial. Like, he was engaged in a number of controversies with feminists as a result of that. I don't think he's as simplistically traditionalist as some people make him out to be. Certainly, as many of his online, at least not at that point.
But even in 87, he posits that traditionalism is actually fake and that we needed to find a working class traditionalism, and he didn't know what that was. Yeah. Like, that's actually in his response to Lillian Rubin and the 87 Tikkun essay, which is the one the post leftist like, because if you want to find where he says, "I have left the left," it's in the response to Lillian Rubin in his 87 Tikkun essay. But it's funny because I miss the fact that the first part of that exchange is actually him denouncing the Reaganite right as a failed response to the failure of the left. Like, that's his or not a failed response. He basically posits it as a totally false response. And that they hit on real problems that the post 70s left ignores: schooling, education, familiar relays, breaking down of familiar bonds, the end of the family wage. But they bait and switch. That's his critique of Reaganism, is a bait and switch towards neoliberalism. Whereas he sees the left basically putting its head in the ground, celebrating their victories in the 60s as if the 80s is the same thing, and abandoning the working class altogether for niche subjects. And he also basically accuses, even in early writings, he was a little bit skeptical of feminism. So like he is familiar with 19th and early 20th century feminism in a way that I think people don't give him credit for. But he points out in Agony of the American Left and in World of Nations that it was suspicious that in the beginnings of the decline of the family wage, and he's seeing this while this is happening. We got to remember he starts writing about this in 68. That Betty Friedan style feminism is becoming really popular, which is a good way to hide the fact that the wages are decreasing in real terms, but not in, like, you need more people to work. And this whole thing that he sees by the 1980s is like, look, the feminism that won was a feminism that could justify forcing everyone into the workplace. He does have some fairly reactionary things to say about homosexuality. unfortunately or fortunately, it was not out of line with about a third of the new left. I mean, he basically echoes Eric Fromm on homosexuality as a form of narcissism. So that's not great. He also, unlike say Lacan or some of the later Freudians who take the gender roles as symbolic, Lash reads them extremely literally. And as we were talking about off air, he's very influenced by Russell Jacoby, Philip Reef, although he thinks Philip Reef is too right wing.
Mm-hmm.
And although he does have Philip Reef's distrust of the therapeutic, that's definitely in there.
Yeah, the triumph of the therapeutic was definitely foundational for him.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, exactly. Like what I was struck by, and again, like I want to stress, like off the bat, I probably disagreed with, especially the general thrust of some of his ideas in Haven in a Heartless World. And I really thought that he gave short shrift to Engels and to historical Marxism, insofar as he dismissed their entire the origin of the family and whatnot as the sort of socialist theory of the family. He adopted Weber's line there.
He also later on in 87 claims that like no one in anthropology thinks that like the family was not a man and a woman getting together for the purposes of social reproduction and literal reproduction of a child, which made me laugh that he said that in 87 when I'm like, there's by the 80s, like symbolic kinship is literally the main thing that anthropology is doing. So I mean, I want people to know that like I think we both think Lash gets some stuff majorly wrong, but I also think if you go back and read Haven in a Heartless World, he isn't saying what a lot of people think he's saying, and he might not even be saying what he's saying later. Like,
yeah, I mean, I think it gets worse, like in the late 80s, early 90s. But I was impressed by just the quality of his understanding of the Freudian theory of the unconscious and of development, childhood development, and like again, like I do think that insofar as it is a strong interpretation of Freud's theory, I think it's because Lash takes it almost entirely from Russell Jacoby, who was considerably younger than him, but who was very influential to him.
Yeah, in the archives during this time period, there's a ton of Jacoby letters. There's a ton of letters to Richard Sennett, and there's a ton of letters to Philip Reef. So we know that these were the people he was very much in correspondence with during the writing of that book, and it almost seems like he's trying to work out Richard Sennett's like Decline and Fall of Public Man, also in the Culture of Narcissism, and combine it with his stuff from Russell Jacoby to deal with what he sees as the problem of the left liquidating itself. I mean, like this is something that's interesting. I think Goldner and since we're talking about both, Goldner and Lash actually share this concern, although they would have completely different diagnoses as to why. That the left in the 70s and 80s was totally liquidating itself out and was actually in denial about both its own past and also the fact that it had basically failed at everything it said it was set out to do in the late 60s. So I mean, I find that interesting. I do think there is there's a strain of scholarship about Lash right now that tries to argue that he abandoned Marx for Freud. I find that interesting in so much that there's still more Marx in late Lash than there is Freud in late Lash, even though he clearly loves Freud. But by the time you get to The True and Only Heaven, he's not writing about Freud that much at all. So I think that is interesting to me. And it is interesting to me when people try to accuse Lash of being like a Herrenfolk socialist, when like his favorite leftists tend to actually be like black populist and black power people. So it's just a very strange reading of him. Um,
Yeah, what's also interesting to me is like he also is clearly very interested in the Frankfurt School, and I mean, again, he gets a lot of this through Russell Jacoby. Russell Jacoby's own interpretation of psychoanalysis is vectored through Adorno's essays on Freud. Um, but what's interesting to me is that um, like Lash just clearly despises Wilhelm Reich, and not like the late Wilhelm Reich, but like Wilhelm Reich of the 30s when he was talking about the authoritarian family. And he really dislikes the Frankfurt School writings of the 30s, and he absolutely
he
the
loathes the authoritarian personality,
he despises the authoritarian personality. He thinks it's the worst thing that the Frankfurt School ever
which
put
I
out.
happen to agree with. that it
I
is the
mean,
worst thing that Frankfurt
it's
School put out.
well, I think that some of its empirical premises are perhaps a bit flawed. I mean, again, they were under a lot of pressure to produce an empirical study,
Well, I
and
mean, what's interesting to me though is the other empirical study on the same subject actually finds that the working class is not nearly authoritarian as they find it. Like there was another study at the same time. It's discussed in Martin Jay's book on the Frankfurt School. Actually, he mentions
interesting
it.
dialectical
So,
imagination. Yeah, it's been
yeah,
a long time, but what's interesting though is that ironically, like the thing that inspired Lash to write this book, according to his biographer at least, and it makes sense, is like Horkheimer's later writings on the family are very conservative.
oh
Um,
yeah,
And I mean, I would say like in the middle, like he writes an essay called Authoritarianism in the Family in 48, which is different from his essay from 36 on authority in the family.
mm.
Authoritarianism in the family, I would argue that that's still quite dialectical in terms of um, not nostalgic for, but like seeing the bourgeois family as producing strong subjects capable of resisting authority. He sees
Hmm.
that as being thrown into crisis by the further development of capitalism. Um, but in any case, like Lash clearly took that and several of Horkheimer's later remarks and tried to spin an entire theory out of it. Again, I would like there are aspects of Haven in a Heartless World. I think that he's a very interesting reader of various sociological accounts of the family. Um, uh, a bit glib, but at times interesting reader of historical attempts to trace the genealogy of the family and its development. And again, the stuff on Freud and Freud's theory is very strong because, again, it's taken directly from Jacoby, and Jacoby's work is itself very strong. Um, yeah, I guess like that's, you know, I've I've been interested in revisiting just and picking your brain about it a bit, just because I know you've been working on this stuff in a lot greater depth than I have, and because it's come up recently in the context of Anselm Yop's Self-Devouring Society, which is a very interesting book. I'd be curious to know what you make of that as well.
I haven't read Yop's book yet, but it's definitely on my thing since I'm writing like a book that requires me to read both. I mean, I have now read, as far as I know, I'm always finding stuff that I haven't read. Like there was a Marxist Perspectives article from 1978 that I had not read, and I read last week. But almost everything Lash has ever published, so I can even do stuff like this chapter of Culture of Narcissism was actually written kind of, sort of, as a paragraph in an essay he wrote in uh, a New York Review of Books article. Like you can just, I've
Oh
gotten
yeah,
that.
there's stuff from New York Review of Books, and like he wrote an interesting sort of follow up review of a French book called The Policing of Families, or was
Yep.
translated as The Policing of Families by Jacques Donzelot. Which it's interesting that uh, uh, Barrett and McIntosh, I believe, who wrote a book called The Antisocial Family, they kind of they criticize at length both Lash's um, Haven in a Heartless World and Donzelot's policing of families. And so, I mean, what's interesting is Lasch is kind of a Freudian Marxist of the Frankfurt School, at least variety, like, or at least clearly inspired by the Frankfurt School. Donzelot is he's a Foucauldian. They actually prefer Lasch to Donzelot in this, even though they're very critical of him. They at least think that he states his case more plainly than Donzelot does.
So if you've read The Minimal Self, which most people haven't, unfortunately, even though it was supposed to be the easy book, you actually get into all these debates in French psychoanalysis, of which Lash picks a side with someone whose last name is almost unpronounceable for me to say, who fought with Lacan. Jean. Oh, man. But it's interesting who isn't in there. So for one of the things, there's tons of French psychoanalysis in Lash's Minimal Self. Lacan is mentioned once in a footnote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jacobi only ever mentions him briefly in, like, I think the introduction to, like, the edition from the 90s of Amnesia, the Social Amnesia. I think Jacobi has no interest in actually delving into Lacan any further, which is, I find, hilarious, and I'm perfectly fine with that. But yeah, it's like, yeah, it's interesting. Like, what's great, like, I mean, in talking to you, who you clearly know, like, all these different phases of it, are so much more familiar with it, is I've just been, like, extremely dissatisfied with both the anti-Lashians and the pro-Lashians of the last 5 years.
Oh God, yeah.
I mean, like, on both sides, it's really, because I don't think Lash is somebody who really deserves to be defended in any vigorous way. I think he's more wrong than he is right, though he's an interesting figure to sort of grapple with.
I would actually, my caveat to that is I actually think early Lash is very, very interesting. So, like, Lash from his dissertation on American liberals up through
on the Russian Revolution.
Yeah,
up
through,
that's an interesting book.
Not read by anybody. Like,
yeah, barely.
And
I only read it, like, insofar as, like, I studied the history of the Russian Revolution, and I thought it was an interesting sort of attempt to, like, look at the way that people reacted to it, which not a lot of people did.
Right.
So I was appreciative of that.
I think his first 4 books from that book up through World of Nations are solid. I think Heavy and a Heartless World to Minimum Self are fascinating. Parts of but I know why people like, Anna Keshin of Red Scare, like, love Lash, because if you read, like, his stuff from the late 70s, he'll say something about feminists encouraging social discord and blah, blah, blah. And they'll pick up on that and they'll miss everything else. Like, and actually they're kind of guilty of the same reading of Lash that Lash was complaining about when everybody saw him as, like, Richard Wolfe in the 70s, which is like just a moralistic condemnation of today's narcissistic left that failed, which is not really what he was interested in, at least at first. And one of the things I would say about his 80s period is he's out in the wilderness. There's one thing, though, I really want to emphasize about him that I'd be interested as Anselm Jopp actually picks up something about this, is it's something that Doug Lane actually also caught on to Lash, is that Lash's view of political economy is basically that of Sweezy and Baron. So he kind of thinks that whatever's happening in the reaction to the 1970s crisis, that the fundamental contradictions of capital were solved negatively by Fordism, which is interesting to me because that's not totally copacetic with his reading of, like, the societal narcissism being based in, like, primary and secondary narcissism, and secondary narcissism. Secondary narcissism is primarily understood as the psychology of Fordism, And I mean, it's interesting when people try to use Lash today too, when they talk about, oh, today is like just like culture of narcissism. I'm like, you should go back and read the book again, because he actually says that this culture is ending. That like this is on its dying legs.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the number one assumption. In the 80s, he's totally lost as to what to do. Like it's one of these periods where like he seems totally disgusted by, like, he's initially, for example, a big, in the 60s, he's actually a big early proponent of Foucault, which is surprising, but it's true.
They participated in a conference together.
Yep. He uses him to analyze the beginnings of the American sanitarium system in the 19th century, and he definitely is straight up just using Foucault, and does reference him.
Foucault is actually somewhat. I mean, he didn't mention him many times, but the times that he did mention Lash, he was quite appreciative of his writings.
Right. So it's interesting to me, like, but by the late 80s, he seems very turned off by where the left is going. And he's, even when he engages with partisan Marxists, they tend to be Trotskyists who are talking about the false consciousness of the U.S. working class. And I think we forget that, because we are living in a time where, like, we're not blaming the working class for the problems of the working class. We're blaming everybody else, the PMC, whatever theory of the week you want to resurrect. It's interesting to see it. I also would say one of the things that's frustrating about Lash, as opposed to someone like Goldner, is Lash doesn't have a clear and coherent conception of what class is.
No, I mean his understanding of I mean, yeah, I would not be surprised if it was lifted from Baran and Sweezy. That was definitely the sort of prevailing new left interpretation of capitalism. Their book Monopoly Capitalism, incredibly influential, or Monopoly Capital rather. But yeah, in any case, like I'm very curious to read what you and your co-author have to say about Lash, just because I've been so dissatisfied with both the pro Lash and the anti Lash people in online discourse. There was one book that dealt with the family through a kind of neo-Lashian lens that was kind of ambivalent, but trying to take up Lash in a kind of positive way. The Daniel Tutt book, but I really could not make heads or tails of that book. I had, for the life of me, I could not understand what he was driving at. But I know that he seemed to sort of argue in favor of some of Lash's theories about the family.
Yeah, he also calls Lash a neoconservative at one point. I mean, Tutt's a friend. I was just on the show talking about Eugene Genovese. So I
mean, he's a smart guy. Like I wasn't clear exactly what his argument was.
I read the same book, so, and I was also like, okay, are we supposed to like Lash, or are we supposed to think that he maybe has a? I think what Tutt's basic argument is the family abolition people have not really understood all the implications of their own argument, and that also that, like, capital's perfectly fine at destroying the family, thank you very much, which is an old canard, but also kind of true one. Like,
that is one of the points that Lash harps on quite a bit, and I know he has this bit. I think probably the thing I was most confused by was his. Maybe it's just because he's invoking concepts with which I'm not that familiar, but he was talking about how the family abolition authors are stuck in a mimetic rivalry with the more conservative pro-family elements, and that the two are just feeding off of each other in some way. Not
to bring us too far afield, I actually think that's kind of true in Sophie Lewis's recent book. So,
I mean, I personally I just found Lewis's book a bit just like some of her turns of phrase were a bit like too high flown, poetic. I thought that what she was, most of the things that she was trying to argue, I think were put in a much more sober and just like thought out way. Obviously, in a much longer book by Michelle O'Brien.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's just yeah. I
I
don't know.
would say reading Melinda Cooper's book on the family was a good answer to some of the stuff Lash doesn't see in the beginnings of neoliberalism as far as like what it's actually doing.
Mhm.
And I would tell people to read that. What's that book called? I think it's like Family Values. Hold on.
Family values. It's
Yeah.
like she's very interested in the sort of deep history of neoliberalism, and like in terms of just like the historical origins of it and its like highest expressions of thought, which yeah, that was an interesting book too. Quite
But
different
yeah,
from the a
yeah.
lot of the more like straightforward family abolition um, texts.
I
So
mean, there are. Yeah. Go
they
ahead.
they they're um, they invoke that book, Cooper's book, a lot.
So, but I'm also with you. As I haven't liked like the. I think the pro Lashians right now who talk about his stuff on the family. I mean, there's pro Lashians like his students, Chris Lehman and Kevin Matson, who are more interested in his writings on populism.
Mhm.
That will defend him as roughly remaining a leftist. And I would say that even after his Tikkun article, if you actually read the preface to The True and Only Heaven, even though it's a critique of progress, he still sees himself as trying to revitalize some sort of left populist tradition.
Mhm.
And he's really mad at Marxism for abandoning the working class. Like that's his big
Mhm.
gripe.
Mhm.
But he also whites Marxism off way too fast later on. Like it's just by the minimal self, he's already talking about like, you know, this and this and this has been shown to be not true, and you feel like he's internalized a lot of the reaction to the new left from the new left itself, actually. So it's an interesting kind of development. Um,
I mean, aside from just like the sort of pop podcasts, like sphere of like, uh, popular repopularization of Lash's ideas and the sort of orbit of Red Scare, you've seen some authors in, well, I mean, like Angela Nagel had a piece in the Lamp, and which is like a Catholic quarterly, and
there's
Nina.
parts of Lash in Kill All Normies too, actually. So
Yeah, yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Um, and even Nina Power in an article for Compact, which it's just it's funny like reading her like I think it's an article Left and Right versus Mom and Dad. It's basically Lash's argument, stated much more succinctly, trying to boil it down. But again, like it's just funny because Power, like 10 years ago was like writing essays in favor of Shulamith Firestone's like abolition of the family, like or at least of the nuclear family. So yeah, it's just interesting the way that these things have turned, the way that online discourse has kind of just scrambled everybody's coordinates, and
well, yeah, and maybe to tie this back into Goldner, I mean, like when I was saying, like Amy Therese before she went full reactionary, just outright, was somehow trying to thread the needle between left communism and Lash and Daniel Bell. And I, you know, and
yeah.
the only thing I can see that they share is a critique of the social democratic to Marxist Leninist back to progressive social democracy left. Like that is consistent on both sides. They're both very frustrated with that movement, and how it leads most people into like atomized consumption of politics as an expression of self. I mean, like that is something lashes on too early.
Hmm.
And that is not, I think we talk a lot more about it now. I mean, I know I talk a lot about it, but like people whose politics like they don't do anything in regards to politics. They like have Twitter forums and stuff they follow. And I mean, even when we talk about this rebirth of Marxist Leninism that's happening over the past 5 years, it hasn't led to like massive Marxist Leninist parties. It's not like I think the PSL has 20,000 members, because it doesn't. And you know, we all know the PSL was originally Trotskyist anyway. And it's not like
the long history of Marxism.
Yeah. Which they try to. My favorite thing is watching all the edits on Sam Marcy's Wikipedia page where they keep on trying to say that he gave up on Trotskyism in like 52. Like, it's just funny. But I see that frustration, and it's kind of a shadow or counter tendency to what I would like to call the eternal return of Peter Cornejo, where you have like these Marxist-Leninist and Trotskyist unity groups that try to, like, I don't know, Peter Cornejo's like Marcyite light, you know, but then they try to enter in popular fronts with social democrats, and it's an utter fucking mess. And I mean, Peter Cornejo both gave us the Green Party and the New American Movement, which is part of the other side of the founding of the DSA. I mean, like, it's you see this, and I understand how someone like Lash and someone like Bordiga, if you're just alienated by that, you could definitely end up trying to hybridize them. And I think we've seen this before, and that's why I brought up the stuff about France. Now, in no way would I imply that Lash is anywhere near a negationist or anything like that. In fact, if anything, that stuff would terrify the shit out of him. But it is interesting that the frustration with the mainstream left kind of, well, when I call it mainstream, that's probably a little bit too optimistic. But this frustration with the like the social democratic / Marxist Leninist popular frontist orientation towards progressivism kind of leads to both tendencies, sometimes in the same people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, actually, it's funny, like, in terms of like Lashian French connections. I would say like the one kind of intelligent interpreter of Lash, again, like, you know, he's very conservative. I think he calls himself a Tory anarchist. This guy, Jean-Claude Michet. Mm-hmm. He's one of the few who's kind of like taken up Lash and tried to build upon his theories in a more, I guess, comprehensive way. Again, and I know of him, you know, through a book he wrote on liberalism, but also insofar, again, as Ansel Miop has kind of engaged with his writings as well. But yeah, I understand it. It was probably a bit of a 180 pivot from Goldner to Lash, but I don't know. It's been interesting. This, like, yeah, the dissatisfactions with the prevailing tendencies on the left can go any number of directions. I certainly am much more of the Goldner cast of mind in terms of just like, well, not just because he's had like such a profound influence on my own way of thinking, but just in terms of my own predilections. But, you know, there clearly are many pathologies that exist. There's much to be dissatisfied with. And we can see it, you know, that we really are, you know, a friend of mine recently said, you know, we're entering the years of lead here, where, you know, it's pretty bleak. And there doesn't seem to be much in the way of like an organized, coherent response to the problems that you know society is facing today.
The only organized left we seem to have right now is in resistance to the occupation of Palestine. And even it doesn't have a clear way forward other than to hope that a BDS like movement would lead to a similar scenario as it would to South Africa, which I take the very unpopular view of, while the BDS movement is worth supporting, it's not gonna, like, the similarities with Israel to South Africa is the apartheid situation, and that's pretty much it.
And I mean, in many ways, like the situation for the Palestinians is much worse than it was for the Black South Africans. Insofar as is Israel, since this end of the Second Intifada, has kind of done away with its dependency on Palestinian labor, and so it's dispensed with like any kind of dependence that they had, and thus any kind of leverage that the Palestinian working class might have had is vaporized insofar as like they've moved towards employing Eastern European and East Asian migrants.
Right. So the number
one, the political economy is very different. Obviously, like it's like the backlash on the university campuses has been stark and very disturbing.
Stark and disturbing, and more extreme than even for BLM, which were arguably more dangerous to the status quo if they had actually succeeded.
Yeah, I mean, it was surreal, honestly. Like going down to Washington Square Park the other night and seeing the walls that have been erected. I mean, they're, you know, just the fact that university administrations are willing to go to such lengths and to create such like what could so easily be like seen as like a sort of parallel to the kinds of border walls that are being set up, that have been set up between Israel and parts of the occupied territories. It's just
But it's interesting to me that I would agree with you that this left actually, you know, Goldner was so old by the time we saw the Bernie movement, although he did write about it. That
he wrote a really interesting, like his response to the 2016 election, I thought was one of the best ones. The editorial that he wrote about, he was trying to say that there are people who, you know, in terms of who we're looking to appeal to, there are enemies who voted for Hillary, and there are friends who might have voted for Trump. In terms of looking to people like, you know, these are the choices that people have made within this extremely limited framework of bourgeois electoral politics. That, his interest, and he pointed out that, like, at least in the 2016 election, 17% of the people who voted for Trump had supported Bernie in the primaries against Hillary. So he was still, like, for 2016 he was still, like, Goldner was still, you know, quite active in terms of just like keeping up with events. I think around 2020 2021
he just wasn't in good enough health, from what I could tell.
His health had declined, and I think he was just, you know, understand.
Also, he was kind of ancient, to be fair.
Like, he was I just think quite distressed at the state of the world. Just, I mean, I think that he'd been doing this research on China for close to a decade, a little over a decade at that point. And either it wasn't adding up to what he wanted to be able to say theoretically about it, or he wasn't able to, or his, you know, he wasn't able to sort of bring it into the kind of order that he wanted to, or some combination of that. And that, I think, also deeply upset him toward the end of his life.
It was interesting to me. I've been, you know, Sean, you know, mutual comrade of both of ours, and I have argued on China multiple times because I am a mild, and I mean this very mild, China defensist. But I've also been very much like, I don't get what the left, like, every prediction I hear about China makes it sound like it's Big Rock Candy Mountain, and they barely have the social services and healthcare that the U.S. does. So, like, what are you on? That, you know, that there's also been this conflation of Xi and Deng as if they have the same policy, which of course Xi himself promotes, but it's actually not true. Xi's big thing was to take some of the policies of Bo Xilai and some of the early tens neo-Maoist, and to reincorporate them and reincorporate their rhetoric and actually do like social welfare in the parts of the country that still have a pretty significant peasantry. And that's why it's popular, or was popular. I mean, it's getting hard to tell because the financial stats out of China look pretty dire right now, and the access has definitely decreased. You've noticed that I haven't seen as much out of Swang, for example, these days. Or also, oddly, I also haven't seen as much out of like explicitly pro-China outlets like Red Sails and
what was the anti-Chuang
the Zhao
publication?
Collective or whatever.
The Zhao, that's it. Yeah.
That was like on it was like the Confucius Institute, but for communists. Yeah, I mean, there's been that. I mean, we have seen this weird. One of the things that makes the current moment, and I would love to have Goldner write about this, is the liquidation of the differences in Maoism. Because one of the things about the Maoism that you and I encountered in the aughts hated China. Like, it was weird, but like basically everything after 1978 was considered like revisionist garbage. So like.
Yeah, like the hard FRSO and the Avakianite. So again, just on the subject of the university protests, when I went up to Columbia a few days ago, I was amazed by there was this big Revolution Books news book stand, like 2 blocks away from campus. Everything was locked down, but to see the Avakianites out in force like that, I wasn't even aware that they still had that many members. Especially since they're weird, like pro-democrat. Avakian had this inexplicable obituary eulogy, really, of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which is just like blew my mind.
I guess he's just picking up the spirit of his old former comrade Rob Reich. I mean Bob Reich. So for those you don't know, I think Robert Reich was either in or adjacent to a proto Revolutionary Communist Party organization. So
Hilarious.
It's I mean, it's interesting what Goldner called, though. I mean, like when Goldner's critiquing these Maoists, how many of the Maoists of the 70s and 80s ended up like progressive Democrats in the aughts? Like Jean Quan is the one I bring up all the time, former mayor of Oakland. But like, there's tons of them. Like there's just so many of them just became like standard Democrats.
Yeah, what's her name? Bill de Blasio's wife.
Yeah,
was in the Combahee River Collective.
And I would also have loved to know what he thought about the Renaissance in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020 of the Combahee River Collective, without acknowledging that most of those people were still alive and had politics that we weren't discussing today. It was a very weird moment. I mean, I would be despairing too if I was Goldner and I was so upset about the way a lot of the new left ended up, and then to see it all resurrected without any context in response to the stuff that happened in the mid-aughts. I mean, in 2012, 2013, 2014, I actually thought left communism and its loud and very poetic younger brother Communization were going to be a major tendency in the American left. They seem to be gearing up for that. And then by 2017, we're back to a similar, we're not all the way back to like the 90s where like 5 people know who these people are, but like we're back to basically the ICT, ICC, PCI, etc., representing the PCI international, not the Italy, representing the sectarian movement and them being about it. And then a lot of I think we do have to admit, a lot of former left communists cut right, like they did.
Well, I mean, many of them were swept up in what they thought was perhaps possible. Corbyn, Sanders, like they. I mean, I don't know. People from all sorts, every single sectarian tendency seem to liquidate themselves, not just the left communists. But for me, I mean, just given the attitude of left communism towards electoralism, um, that it's perhaps more surprising to me than Stalinist or Trotskyist, sort of like soft Trotskyist, you know, getting drawn into the Sanders movement or the Corbyn movement or whatnot, or
Or even
Melanchthon
like
in France or
communizationists
whatever.
in the DSA.
Yeah, I mean,
Like,
there
they're
there is
weird.
like there is some the Communist Caucus out in California.
Yeah,
I have no, yeah, I
they're
have no
not
idea.
they're not communizationists anymore. They are now pretty strongly Mao influenced. I mean, I'm sure somebody would not tell me they were Maoist. They'd probably get mad at me for saying that. But it was very interesting. Like if you read their reading list, it starts off as like kind of left communist adjacent and ends up very like workers' inquiry, which is good. Maoism, structural Althusserianism, and like to be fair to Althusserians, there's kind of a late Althusserian left and a middle period Althusserian Stalinism. I mean, like you can go all like Althusser is a fucking wild figure himself, so you can go all over the place with it. But that's where they ended up. I have no idea, where this is all going to go. One of the things that I was laughing about a little bit is it feels like the book on Bordiga that came out by Brill came out a little bit too late. So it's
You
it.
know,
Mhm.
Bordiga had kind of had passed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. Like again, like I of course, intellectually, I was interested in Trotskyism. I learned about that largely through this. First of all, the study of early Soviet history, and then through the anti-war movement, just coming into contact with Trotskyist sects and studying critical theory in undergrad and then grad school. Um, but then, really 2013, 2014, beginning to study the left communist traditions with which I was a lot less familiar, particularly the Bordiga stuff, but also the sort of fusion, the 70s fusion that the ICT and others attempted. I found interesting, and I still do think that the ICT puts out some out of the various. I mean, they don't claim to be a party, but out of the various formations that exist on the organized communist left, I mean, I think that they still do extremely high quality work and a lot of stuff worth engaging with. But yeah, it does seem like a lot of the interest in that, just as like most of the various Trotsky sects, apart from like the really hardcore ones. I mean, I guess the Sparts have even softened a bit. They aren't just denouncing people left and right anymore. The IBT has always been a bit friendlier, but the Iggy's, the IG people, I guess they have a big section, at least in the CUNY campus in New York and in Mexico. But
and the
yeah, I mean,
IMT is still pretty big.
the IMT is still like forging its own path or whatever. But yeah, I mean, most of them, like the ISO's gone. Socialist Alternative seems to have largely just liquidated itself. Um, Socialist Appeal, a lot of those, like, I mean, if they're not in the DSA, then they're basically writing in publications with a lot of people who are members. But I mean, I know there was a big hullabaloo within the DSA about entryism and whatnot, but I don't know, it's kind of a sad end of like once vibrant political host of political traditions, but such is the state of
Well, that's the danger of liquidating yourself into a clearinghouse of sex. Is if the clearinghouse of sex goes down, all the sex in it go down too.
yeah, I mean, it's also like I mean, it's also tough because I do view most of the sects as like clear dead ends, clearly disconnected from reality, even if they bore some like distant relation to a once living tradition. It's just like it's So on the one hand, like, why should I be sad to see these sort of living fossils kind of like finally?
Except the living fossils that survived are worse.
Yeah, I mean, for the living fossils that have finally like come to the realization of their own extinction, I mean, I guess they've I mean, good on them for understanding that conditions no longer correspond to the various theories that they concocted to try and claim lineage with whatever revolutionary tradition they did. But at the same time, like by just like enter like giving all that up in order to just back some bourgeois party in what is functionally just a wing of the Democratic Party, I don't view that as an improvement. So it's I don't know, it's difficult.
It's hard for us to go back. I recently on my Patreon ad for my Patreon put a an archive episode when I was talking to Luigi. I can't remember his name. From the IWW about where the left should clear into. And we were arguing at the time that it should have been the IWW because it didn't have an established relationship to any party, and we were not yet quite in a party. Yeah, I'm not anti-party for those of you who come at me, but I do. A premature party formation becomes a sect. Like that's what it does.
Yeah. Interestingly, like on the subject, Goldner had nothing but love for the Wobblies. I mean, he understood that they were a shell of what they once had been, but he still spoke quite fondly of just the what the IWW had represented, and still thought that like out of what existed, the IWW was not the worst game in town.
No, I think that's where I kind of am now. Is the IWW like sucks probably the least, which is not saying much, but it would have been interesting because in some ways, one of the things that I think that Goldner was kind of aware of is this attempt in left politics to bypass the need to build up a larger working class support base by going directly for the executive, and because the critique seemed to have been from that the Gen X left, to talk about a left no one ever talks about because it barely existed, went hyper localist and hyper cultural and hyper issue driven, right? And I think that's all true, actually. And so much of there wasn't Gen X left, that's what they did, and that it didn't go anywhere, so that we needed to go for a national subject. But that led to one high methodological nationalism. I mean, one of the weird things about 2015 to 2019 is the left barely talked about other countries, except like maybe talking about Latin America as other examples of things we could do. Like,
Yeah, or they would like yeah, they well, I mean, there was Bernie was like, look at the Corbyn movement. Corbyn was like, look at the Bernie movement. They were both like, look, isn't it great what Syriza has done? Or
yes,
isn't it great that
Podemos.
Podemos, like, I mean, that was the extent of their internationalism. Or I guess they would look to Brazil, the left populist.
Everybody still looks to Lula, even though we have to forget the Dilma Rousseff thing happened. Like it's
I guess people have soured a bit on AMLO since he worked so closely with Trump, and it seems to still praise Trump. So
there are other the funny thing for me is like that's not actually the greatest reason to be sour on AMLO. There's other good reasons to be sour on AMLO.
There's a whole bunch. I mean, I just think that's the reason why a lot of American leftists no longer are as excited about him as they once were.
But it does feel like in a world without these kind of critics, be they the kind of right deviationist of Lash, which there's, I mean, to be fair, there's probably a lot more of those still. Some of them have just become outright reactionaries, which I will say Lash never did. I'm going to defend Lash on that to the end. He was not actually a reactionary.
I don't know, like after you know much more after like the 80s. I've read the True and Only Heaven, which
I don't consider reactionary text. I consider it a pretty liberal text. And also, like, his critique of progress was the same one the post-structuralists were making, actually. So I don't even see why people are mad about that. Um, the the uh, the Revolt of the Elites is an unfinished posthumous text, and that needs to be taken into account. He did not feel comfortable with it during his lifetime.
As far as I understand, he was a lifelong Democrat. Like
Yeah.
and I think he was even close with like I know he wrote a critical article about Hillary Clinton, but I think like wasn't he invited by Jimmy Carter to the White House
Oh yeah,
to
yeah. He was invited by the White House. I mean, like most of those new leftists, there was a period where he wasn't. He tried to form a party with Barbara Ehrenreich and Adolf Reed and stuff in '68. So
uh,
so that wing of like the the new left that is kind of still with us. Well, I guess Adolf is the only one left, but and he must have been the youngest at the time, probably.
yeah,
Uh,
he would have been very young.
that wing was very much in his orbit. So I guess you could say like the center of the DSA today was his tendency. So that also puts him as kind of a lifelong Democrat when they gave up on building a workers' party, which he did actually think that they should do. But yeah, he had very jaundiced opinions of the Clintons actually, but he never totally gave up the project, and that's I mean, anyone with a brain probably had a fairly jaundiced opinion of the Clintons in the 90s.
Oh yeah, anyone who yeah just was even like aware it was sentient at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, but I do think like this tendency, because what happens when you shut these critiques out, this left communist critique or this right deviations critique, is that the only thing you can do is double down on developmentalism and social democracy in more and more violent seeming forms and more punitive forms, which then you will downplay the punitive nature of. And I think that was something Goldner and Lash both saw as a problem with neo-Maoism. Like, that like it was basically a revenge fantasy. And I kind of still think I mean, like we see a lot of that today. And I remember, for me, it was actually Ron Tabor, another former Draperite, who ended up an anarchist and an anti-communist anarchist. I'm going to put a pin in that because I don't want to fully endorse Ron Tabor. But Ron Tabor's argument that Graeber's failure would lead to a rebirth of social democracy, and the rebirth of social democracy would lead to a rebirth of Stalinism when social democracy went on the, washed up on the shores of history for failing to do the same thing it had failed to done, 5 other times historically. So Tabor was right. And and he called that in 2012. So it's one of these things that I think we have to look at. And what I find very interesting about the Marxist-Leninism of today, or the Stalinism of today, if we call it what it actually is that we're not even dealing with like classical Popular Front Stalinism or any coherent form of Maoism. We're basically dealing with an incoherent quasi-third worldism or an incoherent patriotic socialist movement that seems to like winners just because they're winners, even though they lost ultimately. So it's a very strange, like, pragmatist response that's also like revenge centered and ultra violent. Even though they don't actually do any of the violence, it's projected elsewhere at all times. So it's a very strange movement that we have right now. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing. I think one of the things that another thing that Lash and Goldner share a little bit is Lash was really worried about anti-Americanism leading to like an orientation hostile to working class Americans. He did not have a problem with being anti-American government. And Goldner seems to not seems to have a similar like weariness of like what we might call mere anti-Americanism, like or mere anti-imperialism. Like there is a reactionary core to some of that, not all of it, and that we should be wary of it. Now, at the same time, if anyone's celebrating fucking NATO today, unfortunately, like some anarchists do, I think they're very deluded. So, I don't know. I don't know how you feel about all that.
Oh, I mean, clearly, you know, it was like like it's been difficult because like I am close with a number of like Ukrainian leftists, but to see, I think there have been some on the Ukrainian left, Ishchenko and others, who've been very principled in their anti-NATO stance and who've been very who've written quite well on the issue. There's a guy who I edited the last issue of Insurgent Notes, which was on the Ukraine Russia war. And it had a host of different opinions. I definitely fell into the no war but the class war, sort of classical left communist. Again,
classical, even Leninist, if Leninists were consistent. But go ahead. Like,
yeah, exactly. But there were others. John Garvey contributed a very long textual argument trying to reinterpret Rosa Luxemburg's criticisms of national liberation. In a way, I'm not sure that that Goldner himself would have been comfortable with, but he did locate some very interesting articles that she had written early on about the Polish party. But in any case, I'm very, and just to be clear, John Garvey is not like pro NATO or anything. His argument was that insofar as there is resistance, homegrown resistance to Russian imperialism, that's that's worth supporting. I'm more ambivalent about that. But yeah, I mean, I have seen the pro NATO cheerleading among some anarchists, among some Ukrainian leftists, um, uh, but
we've also
also
seen plenty of Russian cheerleading amongst
more Russian imperialist cheerleading from certainly from Stalinists, but also various Trots and others. To say nothing of just the sort of MAGA communists and the various
watching
isolationists too.
Stalinists celebrate the Orthodox Church has been a wild thing that I did not expect to see in my lifetime.
Yeah, it also is incoherent insofar as Putin has jailed many Russian communists, for their opposition to him domestically. Again, for them, it's all a game of geopolitics. It doesn't matter as long as they're opposed to America, which is the big baddie in the room. So everybody needs to oppose
to me,
that.
this is the elephant in the room: is when you give up on political economic analysis for driving geopolitics, you end up just picking sides in geopolitics. Like,
Yeah, it's just football. Like it's just
right.
like who are you rooting for? Not that you really have any tangible effect on any of it. I mean, there are people who are more intelligently saying like the U.S. needs to stop funding wars overseas, and that's something like people from the isolationist right to I think a more principled communist stance can get behind. I mean, just like opposition of you know one's own domestic government funding these foreign wars on whatever side they happen to be on.
Yeah, that's basically where I am. Actually, is like we should not. It like I don't think we should definitely be putting the finger on the scale of Russia, but like, I am very much on team. We should be wrapping down the financial and military support for our fucking arms industry, which basically runs the country at this point in some degree. And that would mean objectively staying out of things like Ukraine, etc. And I also do think that the U.S. played a major role in baiting the Russians into that situation, but that does not excuse them for, an expansionist orientation at all. Like, and you know, because if you believe that, you also are like structurally agreeing with George Bush in like 2001 about like preemptive strike, basically, is what that is. And if you know,
Mhm.
if and if you are completely a-principled about that, then there you go. I mean, this is why it's so hard though to have a peace movement right now. You know, even a non-pacifist peace movement is people are kind of incoherent about what they want, how they want these things to wrap up, because it's not like in the past where American imperialism was like direct and we could just get out. You know,
Mhm.
like in the Iraq and Afghanistan situations, this is all proxy war, indirect funding shit, which is
Mhm.
also structurally predictable for anyone who's actually studied geopolitics and what uh, um, multipolarity would lead to if there's not some vision for what multipolar interaction would be. And as I also like to remind people, there's nothing about the Zimmerwald left and thus Lenin that ends up supporting like one imperial pole over another. In fact, that's Lenin's very clear on this and it's consistent his entire life. So like it
Mhm.
is what it is. All right, thank you so much, Ross. Where can people find your work?
Well, I haven't written anything in a while, but I'm hoping I've been doing all this research on Marxism in the family. Probably going to pitch that to Brooklyn Rail. I've written for them. I've written for Mediations, Situations, a bunch of other places. I had a blog. I have a blog. I just don't update it very often. The Charnel House. But in any case, look for that series of essays on Marxism in the family. Hopefully, coming out in the next year or so.
All right. Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Thanks again, man.
All right.